Welcome back to the Bistro. I'm Ryan.
Hey, and I'm Brian.
And this is the Bible
Bistro.
Bistro.
Oh, I didn't know we were doing a song.
Well, it's not really a song. It was more of a tag.
Oh, okay. It's
sting.
Like
it's like a logo sting.
Okay.
That's
So
technical.
it's can you sing it for me? The
Bible Bistro.
Okay.
There's something else that goes with that as well.
So, and this is a podcast all about
The Bible.
theology and things pertaining to the Christian.
Things relating. I finally figured out the word.
Okay, it's not
Relating.
pertaining.
It's not pertaining. As I said repeatedly in these episodes, that is a you word, which is weird because you have some deep words that you use, but then there's some basic words that you can't draw on.
Yeah, like dumpster today. I couldn't think of the word dumpster.
He's like, you had one of these in your drive and it was long and people picked it up. And I'm like, dumpster? Yeah, that's it. And then you used some other. And then we've also discussed the adjective of super.
Okay. So somebody could count the number of times I say super in this episode and send that into us.
Oh, that's super good. Super good. Anyway, but we had lunch together today.
Yeah, it was good. It was nice. We're at Bistro East.
Bistro East. Yes, we ate at Yats, who we've mentioned before. Yes. And we had Chipotle Chicken Alexio.
Which you said is like one of they don't have it that often.
It's rare.
But it's very good. And I will have to say, it was one of the best meals that I've had there.
And you thought? Because when I walked in, I raised my hands and I said Alexio, and you thought the guy behind the counter's name was Alexio.
I thought that was his name. You're like, Alexio.
Alexio, my long lost. No, it's just the food. If it was a person, I would have been like, that's
and we were drinking some good coffee from your nice coffee maker, and
yes,
Lauren helped make that.
Yes, also referred to as the waitstaff.
The waitstaff.
No, we had some wonderful coffee. Yeah. We've had some great lunch, and now we're back in the bistro.
Yeah, we're going to talk about some interesting things today.
A little bit of archaeology today.
Yeah, we like to talk about archaeology from time to time, and there's something that's in the news right now. I don't know if people have seen this or not, but interestingly enough, this is a relatively recent discovery in Jerusalem, in an area of Jerusalem that's called the City of David. It's actually called the City of David Archaeological Park. And there's now
this is a park like you stroll through the said park, or
no? It's a place where there's lots of what would you say? There's educational signs and there's lots of information about it. But it's an active dig. And here, I was saying this to some people the other day that the hard thing about Jerusalem is there's lots of things we'd love to excavate there, but it's very hard to do because, number one, like we have in other places, it's a city where there are people who actually live, there
like utilities,
there are businesses, and then added to that, there are these three major religions that claim different parts of, or sometimes the same part of this as special to them. So you have, Islam, and of course the whole Temple Mount is kind of off limits because of them. And then you have the Jewish people who are parts of it are very special too, and they're Christians. Like you have, the different churches and even different Christian groups that claim various parts. And so it makes it kind of difficult to do any kind of excavation work there. But this one area, it's called the City of David Archaeological Park, because it's kind of the part that was, we think, the oldest part of Jerusalem, where Jerusalem first began. And I'll say, just to kind of give some background, Jerusalem was on a mount that they called, the name of it?
Mount Zion.
Mount Zion. Very good. So
Thank you. You tried. You tried.
So Mount Zion, and there's a valley on either side, the Kidron Valley and the Central Valley, and this really made it a defensible spot. So when they built some walls there in Jerusalem, of course, David moved the capital of Israel at that point during David's reign. He moved the capital there, and it was a very defensible spot, but we think that's where it began in this kind of tip. Of course, city of Jerusalem today is just surrounding it, but this one area just down from, everybody's familiar with the Western Wall. They've seen, I'm sure, images of this, but just down, and in fact, part of the Western Wall and the Southern Wall of the temple is where this park is, and you can go there and you can see some of the excavations that are ongoing. Well, anyway, they discovered not too long ago a cache, a whole grouping of ivory. These little ivory panels. Okay. About 1,500 of them. Some of them,
quite a few.
Yeah, quite a few. Some of them are smaller and some of them are a little bit larger. But they begin to see that they had some repeated patterns to them, and they began to look at them, and they began to realize they probably were ivory that was inlaid into furniture during this period of time. And so it's really an interesting find.
Okay.
this part of the excavation is actually under what used to be a car park or a parking lot, and so they've dug down. They found these, and they think it's a level that would have been about 2,700 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, well, just a thing that we've talked about before is just like as each kind of group kind of came, they just buried.
Yeah.
I mean, in some ways.
Well, and 2,700 years ago is a pretty important date for Jerusalem too.
Right.
So that that would roughly correspond. And I'll go ahead and say some of these ivories had evidence of burning on them. In fact, I've got a picture of them here behind me on the screen if you're watching this on YouTube.
And I'll put it in our show notes as well.
It's part of a story so there's been several news places that are covering this.
See, Brian's got some deep words.
But there's evidence of burning, and so 586 BC was a very important date. That's when what happened? Do you remember what 586?
That is Babylonian.
Babylonians came in. The Babylonians came in and destroyed. 722 is Assyria, but then 586 BC, Babylonians come in, destroy Jerusalem, and so that's probably when we think that this dates to, and they think it was a part of a very luxurious piece of furniture. Probably they think either a throne or a couch, something along those lines. And the interesting thing for us is there's a couple of different mentions in Scripture this. So there's kind of two different ways that this particular find becomes important. Anyway, as I mentioned, there's these repeated patterns. There are a lot of geometric patterns to them, which is significant in this area because there's this command against graven images. So in other places, you might have images of gods or animals, that kind of rulers. But this one is kind of more geometric patterns, some natural patterns like the lotus, and these patterns are ones that we've seen in other archaeological finds of things like jars and other clay materials. So we've seen this in the past, but there's some evidence of this. So I want to look at a couple different ways that this archaeological find can help us to understand some more about the Bible and the ancient world. And this will go along with some of the other archaeological talk that we've had before. One thing I didn't know until some of these news stories came out, I never thought of it. It made sense once you heard it. But during this period of time, ivory by weight was actually more valuable than gold.
Really?
Right. I mean, it's a lighter material, obviously, and what they use is smaller when they do these engravings, and then those would be embedded into wooden furniture that would be bigger. Obviously, ivory you can't make furniture out of ivory itself because it's too brittle and it would break, but it would be embedded in wood and be a decorative thing, but very valuable. Of course, ivory comes from the tusk of elephants. And so the getting them and the finding these elephants, the hunting them, and then transporting them back to Judah, all that made them a very valuable material. And
this kind of reminds me of it had to be something very special. It's kind of like the robe when we talked about the piece of cloth with the purple robe. Just like how that came from the sea snail. But again, like this is something that's rare, and it's going to be a very special piece that someone's going to use.
So this, and like I said, this is brand new. In fact, tomorrow, when we're recording this on September the 12th, just to give you a little, we don't always do that, but here, behind the curtain, this will be out much later. This will be out in October. We're recording it the 12th, and on the 13th of September, so tomorrow, is going to be the first time that these ivories have been displayed publicly. So this is brand new stuff, right? This is just the archaeologists been writing about it and thinking about them. But anyway, there's two ways in which I think they help us to understand and illustrate some of this period of time. So the first is there are some biblical passages that I think this directly relates to. One of them is in 1 Kings chapter 10. And I'll go ahead and tell you, 1 Kings chapter 10 is focused on the time of King Solomon's reign. So let me give you a couple of time periods. David would have begun reigning around 1000 BC or so, and he would reign 40 years, so we're like to 960, and then Solomon takes the throne. And so what happens here is chapter 10 is really, its main purpose is talking about the incredible wealth of King Solomon's reign and just the incredible amount of blessing and an incredible amount of things that he had there. Of course, earlier than this, it talks about him building his palace, and we may go back there and look at a passage in 1 Kings 5 a little bit later. But I want you to look particularly, what passage, I know I wrote this down, verse 18.
Yeah. I was going to say, I was just reading through this.
Do you want to go ahead and read that for us?
Yeah, the king also made a great ivory throne and overlaid it with the finest gold. The throne had 6 steps, and the throne had a round top. On each side of the seat were armrests and 2 lions standing beside the armrests, while 12 lions stood there, and on each end of a step on the 6 steps.
Go ahead and finish that.
Okay. The like of it was never made in any kingdom.
So it's talking about just the incredible opulence. Nobody had ever seen a throne like this. And there's some people who think that the thrones may have been like a couch too. And we're going to see another passage that uses this term couch to talk about it, because it gets, ruling's a grueling job. So sometimes
you just got to lean back. I mean, I can't imagine sitting upright all the time. I'm the king. Right. I need to be able to recline.
Right. So anyway, that's but you see this idea, this ivory, and I think it would be, they're not saying it's this particular throne that's being talked about, but it'd be something like this. It shows that these ivory panels would be used for this kind of very wealthy, very, very opulent kind of furniture. And so here's an example of this in Solomon's reign that we find this. Now, there's another place that it's mentioned, actually, which is very interesting, and that's in the book of Amos. We find another mention to this idea of ivory couches. So look at Amos chapter 6 for me. And Amos is a minor prophet, of course, and one of the things that Amos really spends a lot of time attacking is this idea of what am I trying to say? Injustice. And particularly what he's concerned with is the fact that the wealthy have been taking advantage of those who are poor. And so that's his kind of his main message. Primarily talking to the southern kingdom, but he also here is going to mention the northern kingdom during this period of time. So this is later than Solomon's reign, but it's before that 586 period. So it's, again, between this time that Solomon would have had this throne constructed out of ivory and before the Babylonians came in and completely destroyed the nation. This is Amos chapter 6, starting in verse 1. And I'm gonna read this because I want to stop a couple places and just kind of show you a few things. But verse 1 says, "Woe to you who are complacent in Zion." So Zion, talking about Mount Zion. Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And to you who feel secure on Mount Samaria. So here we're talking about the divided kingdom, right?
Right.
Mount Samaria is a way to talk about the northern kingdom and the capital city there of Samaria. So Zion and Samaria is what's being talked about here. "You notable men of the foremost nation to whom the people of Israel come, go to Calneh and look at it. Go from there to Great Hamath." And here he's talking about these different other capitals in the ancient world is what he's talking about. And he says, "Then go down to Gath and Philistia. Are they better off than your 2 kingdoms? Is their land larger than yours?" So he's kind of talking about the way that God has blessed these places. "You put off the day of disaster and bring near a reign of terror." So, the idea of putting off the day of disasters, a foreshadowing of this Babylonian destruction is going to take place. But there's also a way, even though you continue to rule now and you continue to have the ability to rule, what Amos is criticizing is their own reign. He calls it a reign of terror. And here's where we're getting to what we're really talking about. "You lie on beds," or some translations may say couches here, "adorned with ivory, and lounge on your couches. You dine on choice lambs and fattened calves. You strum away on your harps like David and improvise on musical instruments." Of course, that's biblical injunction against jazz music.
I was going to say that.
Okay, I don't think that's what he's really saying.
Okay.
It has been used for that in the past, believe it or not. But you strum on harps, you improvise on musical instruments. Basically, he's talking about you're living these lives of luxury where you're not really working.
You've got time to sit around and let me try this riff on my harp.
Right. So anyway, you drink wine by the bowlful and use the finest lotions. You do not grieve over the ruin of Joseph, this idea of the divisions of the kingdom. Therefore, you'll be among the first to go into exile. Your feasting and lounging will come to an end. So he gives him that. If you go back in Amos 3, I'll just quickly look here too. This is Amos 3. I know I wrote this down.
No, Amos.
Verse 13. Yeah, he's got some pretty strong language
Debbie
here.
Downer. Whoa, trombone.
But verse 13 says this, "Hear this and testify against the descendants of Jacob, declares the Lord God Almighty. On that day I will punish Israel for her sins. I will destroy the altars at of Bethel. So the northern kingdom had set up these alternate places of worship, and one of them was at Bethel. The horns of the altar will be cut off and fall to the ground. I will tear down the winter house along with the summer house. The houses adorned with ivory will be destroyed, and the mansions will be demolished, declares the Lord. So it's talking about a time where people were really enjoying their positions and their wealth and just the opulence in which they lived. And ivory, this very valuable material and used for decorations on apparently houses, but also on furniture, is one of the descriptions of this. So again, it's kind of interesting that we have these pieces that seem to have been used in this way that have been discovered. And this is the first time these kind of been discovered in Jerusalem, in this place where, Solomon's temple would have been. Again, this is the city of David, so the old part. This probably is where Solomon's. Remember, he built not only the temple, but he also built the palace that he lived in. So it's probably this kind of a structure in which we would have found this ivory furniture.
Yeah, we don't know exactly what it's from, but what we do know is that this was something special.
Yeah, it would have to be. And again, 1,500 pieces of this. This would have been a very valuable. Whatever this adorned, it would have been a very valuable piece. It would have belonged to someone of very, very important prominence. And again, later, not too much after this time of Solomon, then you have Amos criticizing the rulers who are basically, you're living in luxury while there are people who are being oppressed and people who are being mistreated in order to allow you to continue to live this life of luxury.
I just think that's... we'll get into some of the so what of this piece of it. But it's like, again, for me, it's thinking about with Amos I understand that Amos is calling attention to the fact that kingdom is split and so forth, and it was together with Solomon. But we also know that Solomon's reign was not also...
No, and that's...
a very... fruitful for the people either. There was his personal wealth was was great, and the temple was magnificent. But we know short after his death that there were some problems.
Well, I wasn't planning on talking about this, so let's go ahead and talk about that a little bit, because I was going to talk about some other things. But since you mentioned that, the idea of the division of the kingdom, it's pretty interesting. The fact that you have Solomon, who has this incredible reputation for wisdom. And we see that this is what he asks God for. When God says, what is it you'd like me to give to you? He says, well, I'm young and I don't know how to rule, so give me wisdom. And God says, that's a great request, and because of that, then I'm going to allow you to prosper and you're going to receive all this great wealth. But we do see, and here's the thing that a lot of people miss in this whole story, is that in the later part, in fact, we'll look at this maybe in just a minute, but the later part of Solomon's reign, he ends up being led astray from the worship of the true God, while David David, despite his failures, and don't let me forget that,
David had his problems.
Yeah, he had his problems and very serious issues, murder and adultery, pretty big deals, and so there's that part of it. But then he's also called a man after God's own heart. And here's Solomon, on the other hand, who allows his... And of course, the famous thing about Solomon is he had all these marriages, many of which were probably diplomatic. But these foreign women, foreign wives, Solomon ended up worshiping the false gods of the people of these other nations. The responsibility lies totally with him. So here's where I would say, we have to measure that, because a lot of times in Sunday school we get what a wise guy, Solomon, we get all that part of it, and he was, God blessed him in that way. But at the end of his life, his heart turned against the Lord God, and in very serious ways. The accumulation of wealth, I think, is a part of what he sees.
Well, it's always interesting, and you and I have talked about Solomon a little bit, just that end of his life, but kind of going, even with the gift, I think this is kind of for us as Christians, is even with gifts that we've been given by God, that we can turn away from using those gifts. I think that's really interesting, is he gets wisdom, and I think, is it just diplomatic wisdom? Can he not see himself in that whole story as well? No, is it diplomatic wisdom as a king, but can't see where his own heart discern where his own heart is taking him as well.
Well, and I think you're well to say that there's a way in which we need to constantly guard against this ourselves, I think, because, even good things, I've said this before, even good things, if we place them before God, become idols, right? Mm-hmm. Even good things in our lives that God has blessed us with, if we forget, it's one thing for us to be grateful and to thank God for that. It's another thing for us to begin to think, well, this is something that I've accumulated on my own, and, I deserve this and this kind of thing. And so anyway, let me go back to 1 Kings chapter 10. And so I said there was two things. One is, it's always fun when we find these archaeological things that seem to fit very specifically into a Bible verse. But often we say that's not really what archaeology's primary point is, right? Mm-hmm. On this podcast, we've said various times that one of the things that archaeology does for us is it gives us a picture of the culture and the trade and the commerce and the political kind of things that are going on. And so if you look at 1 Kings 10, as I mentioned, the thing that really is being gotten at here is Solomon's reign. Begins with this idea of the Queen of Sheba, who you've heard of before, who comes and she says, I've heard this great reputation, but I had to see this for myself. And it talks about all the things that she saw and the gifts that she brought to King Solomon. And then she says, I couldn't have believed it until I saw it with my own eyes, but now I see that all this is true, that, you have all this incredible wealth. She gives him a gift here. We see in the middle of this in verse 10. I want you to look at verse 22, though, and we'll come back to talk about this guy some more. Chapter 10, verse 22, it says this, and this is an important part of this whole thing in terms of the commerce and the culture. It says, the king had a fleet of trading ships at sea along with the ships of Hiram. Once every 3 years it returned carrying gold, silver, and ivory, and apes and baboons. So ivory, as we mentioned, come from elephants, but of course there's not a lot of elephants in Israel, right?
I have yet to see one there.
Well, maybe at a zoo or something, but we usually associate elephants down with the area of in Africa, right?
Yeah.
And so what we find during this period of time, King Hiram was the king of Tyre. And we've talked about the city of Tyre before. Mm-hmm. Again, there's another place, another kingdom that has a lot of pride. And we could call the nation we could call Phoenicia, because Tyre is really a city that was an incredible port city. It was kind of on an island a little bit off of the coast. And Tyre, because it was an island, that allowed all these ships from the Mediterranean to come and to dock there. It was an incredible place for sailors, a credible kingdom for sailors. And so Hiram and his navy, or his ships, were known to be incredible trading partners. Israel was not so much a maritime nation. They were not known for their sailing ships. So Solomon makes this alliance, and even David and King Hiram had gotten along, but when King Hiram, this is back in 1 Kings chapter 5, when King Hiram hears about David's death, he sends a message to Solomon, and Solomon sends him back a message saying, well, we're going to build this temple. I'm paraphrasing now. We're going to build this temple so we could use your help. And basically Hiram promises to bring all of these cedar trees from Lebanon and all these different places. By the way, Lebanon is what we call this area of Phoenicia today. It's the Lebanese coast, basically Lebanon, just to the north of today Israel, Syria, and then Lebanon. And so he promises all of these incredible trees and everything that become the foundation then for the building of Solomon's temple. And also his palace. And so this alliance with King Hiram is a big deal, but then you see it continues. And King Hiram's ships are the ones that end up going down even into the Gulf of Aqaba, down into the Red Sea, and along the coast of Africa, which allows them to have access to the trading ports where you would have things like ivory. And he mentioned the gold and silver, apes and baboons, right? Mm-hmm. So these are some of the exotic things, if you will, that he brings. And there are other descriptions that we find throughout this entire section of Scripture talking about just the exotic things that Solomon had during his reign. Any thoughts on that, or comments or questions?
I mean,
you don't have to.
Okay, yeah.
Let me go back. I'm going to go back to a little bit earlier in 1 Kings chapter 10, starting in verse 14. The weight of the gold that Solomon received yearly was 666 talents. Now, this is something like 25 tons of gold. And if you heard the phrase king. Not too shabby, huh?
He's got a good, yeah.
So you've probably heard the phrase King Solomon's mines. And the idea is that there's some place, probably down on the continent of Africa, where this gold is coming from. And it's a part of the description of, again, Solomon's power. But what you see in terms of commerce is this trade that's going on. It's Hiram. It's his allegiance or his alliance with this king of Phoenicia, king of Tyre, that allows him to go down. I was going to mention earlier, Tyre is in the book of Isaiah in particular. We'll look at this another day. That'll be kind of fun. But I think we looked at this idea of, did we look at Lucifer?
No.
Oh, never mind. We'll look at this another day. But the king of Tyre is he becomes a symbol of pride as well, because Tyre began to see themselves as an undefeatable basically empire. They had this power, these allegiances and alliances and so forth. I keep saying allegiance. So anyway, this is not including the revenues from merchants and traders and from all the Arabian kings and the governors of the territories. Verse 16, King Solomon made 200 large shields of hammered gold, probably just ornamental, because
gold soft.
Well, it's soft and it's heavy, not practical. So probably for ornamentation. King put them on the palace of the forest of Lebanon. Verse 18, the king made a great throne. We read that earlier. It talks about the size of that. Verse 21, all King Solomon's goblets were gold, and all the household articles in the palace of the forest of Lebanon were pure gold. Nothing was made of silver, because silver was considered of little value in Solomon's days. So again, you see how ways of describing this incredible wealth. It talks about, again, Hiram, as we've already read. Verse 23, King Solomon's greater in riches and wisdom than all the other kings of the earth. The whole world sought audience with Solomon to hear the wisdom God had put in his heart. Year after year, everyone who came brought a gift, articles of silver and gold, robes, weapons, and spices, and horses and mules. Solomon accumulated chariots and horses. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horses. Now, the interesting thing, if you go back in the book of Deuteronomy at the end of it, one of the things that Moses says to the people is, when you enter into the land, and there comes a time where you place a king over you, do not allow them to accumulate large amounts of chariots and horses. And it's almost like we find that during Solomon's reign, everything that was commanded against for the king is what happens. Do not allow them to accumulate large amounts of gold and these kind of things. And yet Solomon, like you said, it turned from a blessing from God into something that God had given him, into something that became the focus itself, I think. The wives that he married, again, were from these foreign kings. And when we say kings here, we're not necessarily saying the kings of countries, but kings of various cities. And all of these diplomatic relationships ended up being what, again, pulled his heart away from God, to the point that we get into the next chapter. If you look at chapter 11, verse 1, King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter, Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. They were from the nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, you must not intermarry with them, because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods. Nevertheless, Solomon held fast to them in love. 700 wives of royal birth, 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God as the heart of David his father had been. And it talks about some of these, Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Moloch. We think that part of some of these gods' worship included child sacrifice. It says that Solomon set up a high place. This is down in verse 7, on a hill east of Jerusalem. Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and for Moloch, the detestable god of the Ammonites. And so he did this, and he offered all of this sacrifice at the end of his life. So,
I don't get it.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard to understand, isn't it? I mean, he had direct. He met with God on more than one occasion directly, and received these words from God. Had advisors and prophets around him to help him understand what he was supposed to do, and yet he allowed it to pull him away. I think. Well, go ahead. What were you going to say about it?
I'm just like, I'm
here at a loss.
Well, yeah, I mean, every time I read this story,
right,
I don't get it.
Well, I think the power, here's the thing. When you have that kind of wealth and that kind of power, who's going to tell you anything other? Part of what and I'm not trying to say, oh, I've got all the answers here, but I will say this, that there is a discipline, right, for us having to be answerable, if you will, to our community around us, right? That's part of the way that we are shaped and formed. I think God shapes us through His Holy Spirit, right? I believe it. You know, the phrase we would use is it's. My mind's not working very good. Sanctification is the word I was looking for. The Holy Spirit shapes us, but that takes place in a variety of forms, right? It's sometimes through our experiences. It's through sometimes painful, those God loves, He disciplines as a child. As a father loves a child and disciplines them. So we get that kind of experience, but we also have sanctification that takes place from our relationships. This part of, not to get on a soapbox for a minute, but it's part of why it's so important for us to be a part of a church community. It's not just a matter of being a Christian on our own, but we need a church community. And part of what that is to help, point us in the right direction. And especially the importance of having deep relationships within the faith, I think, is so that we have people who can speak into our life when they see us, going astray. And so that's part of what I think is going on here, and very important part of it. But it's hard to understand. But what I was going to say earlier, you talked about then the division of the kingdom. Mm-hmm. So during Solomon's reign, he also began to enlist various people from the whole country in order to come and to serve in the capital.
And this is what God warned them about when He said, if you want a king, just know what's going to happen with the king.
Any centralized government, it's true of our own, any centralized government requires people, and often it's young people, right, to work in order to have that central government function. Even in our system in the United States, we have people who go to Washington, D.C. as young people and serve as interns and pages, and we have all these. That's part of what's necessary. And he enlisted these various people from all over. And also, here's the other thing: that to have a centralized government, you got to have taxes, right?
Right.
And so he levied taxes, and this began. And I think especially you look at, and again, this isn't too different from today, right? These people were looking at probably Solomon's opulence and his wealth, and he's like, and you're taxing us, to pay for all this stuff.
You're getting 25 tons of gold a year.
You don't need my 1040 to come in, right?
Bezos of.
So, well, it was, and I think you get to a point. Here's where I was going with this. You get to a point where you think you're above it, right? You're above the law. You're above
the pettiness of the plebes.
I don't know. I've never been in that position.
I'm totally there.
But I think that's part of it. And here's what happens is when there's someone who steps up, it's a guy by the name of Jeroboam. He steps up in order to speak against what policies the king is establishing. And I think initially he's doing it for good purpose. He ends up fleeing for his life, fleeing from Solomon down into Egypt. Mm-hmm. And it's when Solomon dies and Solomon's son Rehoboam comes and takes the throne. Jeroboam comes back and basically says to Rehoboam, you have a choice now. You can either follow in your father's ways or you can turn back. And of course, as we've said before, this ends up in the division of the kingdom. Mm-hmm. Judah and Benjamin, those two tribes become the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom, the northern 10 tribes or 8 tribes, however we count it, split off from Judah. And that's the beginnings of Israel as the northern kingdom and Judah as the separate nation. But
yeah, what I kind of like with this is that they found, going back to our original thing where you're talking about this ivory is it's ivory with scorch marks.
Yeah.
Well, I mean that's the thing. I mean, I don't want to stretch this metaphor, but it's kind of like the thing that we've placed our value in, and this ends up in a pile, burned in pieces, buried underneath a parking lot.
That's and there, my friends, is your lesson for the day.
What? Yeah, well, that was the thing. It was like, this is a sign of my power.
Anything, as Paul would say, anything that we might have considered to our advantage in the past is rubbish compared to the surpassing greatness of knowing Christ. Right.
Right. So, and this is, we value it now for what it teaches us, but it was burned down and smashed up, and throw some sand on it, and out we go.
Yeah, that kind of puts it in perspective. I hadn't thought of that, but you're right. It puts it in perspective.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, if this is, I mean, this obviously I would think has to have something to do from Solomon. You know what I mean? Like he's brought
Solomon
this
or those
someone else very high up,
immediate successors. I mean, it's not too long until
Yeah, that this is Rehoboam or like all of the ones that did not follow the Lord that come after that, but just the opulence, and it can all be taken away. Like, Lord, this is the Lord's, and it has been a gift from him, and if you squandered it. Yeah,
and that's, the message of Amos, and of course other prophets as well. Isaiah, as we've talked about recently, this is the message that God gives is, because your hearts have turned away from me, this is the result. But I do think it's interesting archaeologically. Again, this is, like I said, often we want these, like, let's find this thing that's in this verse. But even if it's not that exact thing, it's very close to this description we have, and it helps, just kind of gives us that much more illustration of what would it have looked like to have a throne covered with ivory, and as I mentioned, overlaid with gold, and just the beauty of that, but also again just that compared to how other people were living in that period of time. And that's the kind of thing that made Amos mad. He saw these people in their houses, their summer houses, and enjoying their time on their incredibly overlaid beds, and here are other people who are suffering. Jeroboam, the same. Now Jeroboam, I don't want to give him too much credit, because
Jeroboam was not a bright shining star.
If you read the book of 1st and 2nd Kings, he becomes the type or the example,
the archetype of evil,
of the evil king. Because what he does is he sets up alternate places of worship. I mentioned Bethel earlier, and then up north in an area called Dan, he set up these alternate places of worship, and said to people, "Don't go down to the temple in Jerusalem. Instead, worship God in this place." And what he set up are these golden calves, right? These graven images, and said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." It's like, I don't think so.
Oh my gosh, I don't get it. I don't get. I would like to think that I'm above it. You know what I mean? Like I wouldn't fall for the same tricks or whatever, but it's just,
and yet we do, don't we? I mean, whatever the temptations that we face, there are times that we fail. It's a different kind of thing, maybe. But I've said before, we don't bow we typically don't have idols in our house that we bow our knee to, and yet there are things that we tend to prioritize over our time with God or our relationship with God, right? So that's what I think we need to be careful of.
Yep. Well, this is all rainbows and puppy dogs today.
Well, I tried to make it something happy. Anyway, it's interesting though. I said this out of Egypt stuff, and that's what we're going to talk about next time. We're going to talk about the Exodus, and I think there'll be some interesting historical and cultural things that we'll learn about the Exodus as well.
Yes. So, and I'll put a link to some of the story.
Yeah.
It should be out in other publications by the time this is out.
By the time, I'd say it'll get even more press now. But a lot of the, it's already starting to get press. Haaretz, which is the newspaper in Israel, one of the main newspapers in Israel, has published this already. And I think what you have behind me is the Biblical Archaeology Review, and I think let's link to that. That's a good story, and they do a good job with kind of showing the connections with some other things. Really, again, I love to stay on top of this stuff from archaeology, and as I've said before, it's not an old thing that everything's been discovered. Right. Stuff's still being discovered today, and here's a example right in Jerusalem.
Yes. Who knows? Someone might get their driveway repaved, and there's something down there.
Well, it's always interesting when there's those kind of things that happen. I'll give you two examples. I've given the one example before. The Givat HaMivtar man we've talked about, the guy who has Yohanan, who has the nail through his ankle, that was as a result of reconstruction taking place after the 6 Days War. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, here was this battle that took place. Buildings got destroyed, and they're coming in, clearing up the rubble. It's like, oh, wait, there's a series of caves down here, right?
Right, yeah.
And it was a series of tombs. I can't remember now, 37 bodies or 40-some bodies that were found in that tomb complex. Gave us a lot of insight. And in fact, again, the first crucified, we now have two crucified victims that we found, but the first example of a crucified buried body that we had found. Here's the other one I always think is interesting, is the guy was... working on the basement of his house and broke into this chamber in Jerusalem and found some ancient dwelling places there. And so, like you said, it's that kind of those kind of accidents that happen sometimes that take us, especially in these places where people have been living for hundreds and thousands of years, just layer upon layer upon layer of civilization, one over top of the other. Just pretty interesting stuff.
Yeah, and I think it's always a great reminder with the archaeology piece to always go like, these are real people with real places, with real that were lived in space and time. And because I think it's so hard for us sometimes to kind of go like, oh, that's a great story, but kind of go, well, it's a story about real.
Yeah, and that's what I love about the archaeology. I think is it kind of brings it into time and space, like you said. It's these are real people and these are real stories. Yeah,
absolutely. All right. Well, Brian, thanks so much.
Yeah, it was fun, Ryan.
Yeah, we'll talk about the Exodus next week.
Yeah, I'll see you then.
See you. Bye.
Bye.